that is so contaminating and contentious that causes so much heartache and risk. We are very committed to working to remove Australia from supplying the start fuel of this risky trade and ending uranium mining.
Let's talk history for a little bit so we can get oriented. What is the background of uranium mining in Australia, and when did the modern era of Australian uranium mining begin?
Yeah, well, there was radium mining and there was mining in different places and over time from the early part of the 1900s through. But the modern era largely began in the 1970s in the north of Australia, particularly in an area that some listeners might know around called Kakadu National Park. It's Australia's largest national park. It's a magnificent area of sandstone escarpment sweeping down to massive floodplains and big winding crocodile and barramundi-filled rivers going out to the Northern Cape. And the area in the 70s was identified as a significant uranium reserve or prospectivity. And so what happened then was a clash that has continued since, the clash between conservation and reserve and protected areas, between indigenous rights and Aboriginal people's aspirations, and between the Australian mining industry and government's desire to exploit uranium. And in the 1970s, the Ranger project was developed. It became operational in the late 70s, early 1980s, and it was basically a trade-off. It was effectively done of like, yes, you can have Aboriginal land rights, yes, you can have a large national park, but the deal is that you say yes to uranium mining at Ranger and to the potential for future uranium mining at a set of other identified uranium deposits within this area. So that sort of tension between industrial development, protection of country, and recognition of the aspirations and rights of Australia's First Nations was started then, and it continues today. And what we've had in that time since the early 1980s when commercial production at Ranger started till now is a long history of uranium operations in Northern Australia and also in Southern Australia, a large operation owned by the world's largest miner, BHP Billiton, in South Australia. And they've always been contested. They've always been controversial. There's been site-specific impacts over tailings management, water depletion, water contamination. It's an issue in this country, Libby, that has always generated heartache and headlines.
It really sounds like business as usual for the nuclear industry because that's the way they operate around the world. With the number of mines that have been created and are in use in Australia, have any of them been rehabilitated? Have they been neutralized and made safe? Or is such a thing even possible?
That's a really interesting question, and the short answer is no to both. No, none have been effectively rehabilitated, and no, I doubt that it's possible, in the Australian context at least. The situation has been that there was a spate in the 1950s and 60s of quick, early, shallow and dirty mining in Australia, where there was a bit of a rush. Uranium was seen as the Midas metal, and lots of small companies got into different places, extracted largely shallow deposits and left. Now, most of those mining operations have been fenced off. There's signs on the outside. There has been some remedial earthworks done to address the worst sort of runoff, and they're effectively left. There were a couple of significant mining operations in Australia's history, one called Mary Kathleen, another called Rum Jungle, a third called Narbalek, which are different mines scattered across the Northern Territory and Queensland in the northern part of Australia, where there have been really quite significant attempts at rehabilitation. There have then been assurances, and people have walked around with the clipboard and ticked it off and said, yes, this is fine, it's good. And then when more independent analysis has happened, and when it's been tracked over time, what was said to be complete and comprehensive and competent has shown itself to be none of those things. All of those sites have significant, continuing and unresolved issues with leachate of sulfides, of contaminants, of radionuclides, heavy metal mobilisation, acid mine drainage, water contamination, the non-isolation of radioactive tailings. So there's really considerable concerns there. And just recently, just in the most recent federal budget in Australia, another $10 million was allocated to a further study to look at options to try and further rehabilitate and quarantine the Rum Jungle project. And it is becoming increasingly apparent that that will take at least a decade and a further at least 200 million Australian dollars to try and bring it back into any shape that is even roughly parallel to acceptable. So what we've seen is mining operations 50 years after they've happened and 20 years after they've been signed off as clean are being continually running sores and weeping spots. So we have no history of good mine closure in Australia in relation to the uranium sector. We have no good, adequate and robust regulation. We have a poor track record. The closure and exit from the uranium sector is often underplanned and often underfunded. And the companies involved, often they have a limited capacity, a limited commitment, and there's also, concerningly, limited accountability. I suppose the take-home message from the Australian experience is even with all the checks and balances we've had, all the skills and technology and dollars that we've got and we've put into the sector, country has never been and is never properly cleaned up. Things are never as good as they were before mining started, and in most, if not all cases, they are considerably and consistently worse.
What, if anything, is known about the health impact of these mines on local populations and on those miners who actually worked on them?
That, again, is a very basic question and a very good question, and one that is very difficult to answer. And it's difficult to answer primarily because the hard data is missing. We have been mining uranium in Australia for many decades now, and it's only in recent years that there has been a cohesive national register of radiation workers. Up until that time, individual records of individual workers were effectively their responsibility. And as you can imagine, it's a highly itinerant, often young men workforce, and young men often think they're bulletproof and they're not particularly fast or worried, and they're certainly not looking about keeping records of today as to something that might make itself manifest in 30 or 40 years. So we have a dearth of data about exposure levels. We know that there have been exposures to workers. We know a whole range of concerns. There's a vast body of anecdotal concerns within union organisations and within workers as well. And it was advocacy from those groups as well as public health groups and environment organisations like ours that helped foster the climate that made the National Register happen. So that's a start, but it's a long way from the end. In relation to communities, again, there is nearly negligible community health monitoring. There are Aboriginal communities near mine sites. In the case of Olympic Dam, there's a township within 20 kilometres, a large township 20 kilometres from the mine site. Negligible community health monitoring. And again, in a high rotation at a mining town. People come in, there might be single men, they stay a couple of years and they move on. They might have young families and kids who are particularly vulnerable, but they move on after 3 or 4 or 5 years. And that sort of that sort of line of tracking and monitoring gets very easily lost. There has been one study by a group of Australian epidemiologists or oncologists and cancer researchers. A group of them joined for a study on cancer amongst the Aboriginal population of Kakadu near the Ranger mine, the area nearest to the Ranger uranium mine, Australia's longest running continuing mine. And what that found is that whereas Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory have a cancer rate which is twice that of the non-Aboriginal community. The Aboriginal community right by the mine site had a cancer rate that was twice that again of the already double high Aboriginal rate. So it was a very significant statistical difference that highlighted an excess in cancers. And there's many anecdotal stories of ill health, cancer, strange diseases, illnesses, etc. Now, it was requested by those researchers that there be a more detailed study that had a broader methodology, a bigger cohort, better testing, and both the federal government and the Northern Territory government refused to advance that. It was a modest amount of money, less than 500,000 Australian dollars a year to do it, and despite requests from Aboriginal organisations and national environment groups and public health groups, the governments ignored that and didn't advance that. Now, it has, in the last year or two, just started to be picked up again and is going to be looked at. But it is a really indicative example of indifference and an example of the questions that are too hard don't like to be asked in the Australian mining sector. I know we haven't got a monopoly on that, but people would rather have a radon meter that measures whether it's blowing west, east or north or south than have a detailed study about health impacts of communities or health impacts of workers. So we're concerned about that. We're also concerned because some of the more cowboy companies have even facilitated speaking tours and presentations to their workers by really disreputable medical analysis that promotes hormesis, the theory that a bit of radiation exposure is good for you. And they talk these tired arguments again and again that you will get more exposure to nuclear materials by eating a banana which contains radioactive potassium than you will by working a shift at a uranium mine. There is a consistent ignorance and a consistent belittling coupled with an institutional history of failing to gather hard data and ask hard questions, which really reduces our confidence in the regulation and the governance of this sector. And if I can give you one more example, Libby, of this. We know that Australian uranium directly fueled Fukushima, and when the UN did its system-wide study into Fukushima in September 2011, one of the recommendations that the UN Secretary-General made for countries that produce uranium was that they carry out a cost-benefit analysis of the sector with a particular emphasis on two aspects. One, the environmental impacts in the area around the mine site, and two, the community and worker health impacts in and around the mining operations. And we said, thank the goddess, we at last have strong, impeccable international organisations source calling for what we've been calling for decades, for a detailed and independent analysis of the impacts around mine site, of the impacts on workers and of the impacts on affected communities. And successive Australian federal governments have flatly refused to address this or advance this, and the companies involved in mining uranium in Australia have flatly refused to address it or advance it, have said this is not our responsibility, this is a matter for the national government. Everyone is hand-passing and pointing to the other one to do the role, and there is this happy little circle in the boys' club of let's just get on and try and get back to business as usual. And the reality is after Fukushima, there is no business as usual with this sector.
One of the things I find not shocking about this, not amazing, but just dumbfounded about it, is that the techniques and the handing off and the lack of accountability and the lack of cleaning up and all of that is the exact same playbook that is used in every national interview that I have done. The report has been from Canada, from the miners in Saskatchewan, from the Navajo miners in the American Southwest, Africa, when we were talking about the mining that had been done there, the exploration of mining. In every case, they leave the waste, they leave the radioactivity, the local communities who are usually First Nations, Aboriginal, Native people of color. So there is a racial genocide aspect to this. It can be viewed that way. That is all